Thanks, friends, brothers, sisters. I won't go on too long because Claire's already hit me at least 3 times. I'm actually a bit scared of her. Comrades, I think the first thing we can do, the first thing we can say is this. The trade unions, everything the trade unions and trade unionists said when the coalition came to power has been vindicated. Not that we can derive any pleasure from that, given the impact austerity is having on our communities. We were attacked and smeared as deficit deniers. On every single condition, every single measure, this coalition's austerity programme has utterly and catastrophically failed. Whether it be borrowing, soaring now as tax receipts and the economy shrink. We all know the official unemployment rate is 2.6 million. We can scrap that because, as the TEC pointed out a few months ago, when you take into account full-time workers forced to do part-time work or economically inactive people who aren't included in the official figures, there are over 6 million people in this country looking for secure full-time work who can't get it. And of course, growth. I don't know if people remember, just before the last election, Labour mocked up a poster with David Cameron as Gene Hunt from Life on Mars smugly perching on an Audi Quattro. And it said, don't let him bring us back to the 1980s. Well, how wrong they were. This recession is far worse than the 1980s. It's far worse than the last double-dip recession in the 1970s. It is more protracted than the Great Depression of the 1930s. We are now in the middle of the longest economic crisis in history. That is, of course, the direct result of an austerity programme that the trade union movement warned about right from the very start. And of course, what the trade unions also have highlighted, quite rightly, is exposed this myth, we're all in this together, a statement which has veered from the ludicrous to the offensive ever since it was first uttered when the coalition came to power. Because as we know, it's a very serious crisis for the majority. The average British worker is now going through the biggest squeeze in living standards since my gran was born in the early 1920s. Public sector workers like nurses, like teachers, like bin collectors, like lollipop ladies, pillars of any decent society, face over the course of this parliament a drop in their income of 16%. And this isn't just forcing them to pay for a crisis they had nothing to do with. It is economic madness, because it is sucking demand out of the economy exactly when we need it most. And I have to say, we have to be clear, for senior Labour politician, a Labour politician comes to the TEC and backs that disastrous policy, the least they can expect is to be decisively booed for supporting that Tory policy. And friends, it's crisis for the majority, but it's boom time for the people at the top. The Sunday Times Rich List each year look at the wealth of the top 1,000 richest people in Britain. Last year, their wealth went up by nearly a fifth. The year before that, it went up by 30%, which is the biggest jump ever recorded. It is crisis for working people, but it remains boom time for the people at the top. But the one thing we have to be careful about and aware of as a movement is this. As people's justifiable anger at their declining living standards grows, what the government and their allies in the media have attempted to do is redirect people's anger from those at the top who caused the crisis to people's neighbours down the street. The working poor against the unemployed over benefits. The non-disabled against the disabled, again over benefits. Private sector workers against public sector workers over pensions. It's the politics of divide and rule. And only a united Labour movement rooted in the experiences of working people can take on that absolutely dangerous policy, because if it is allowed to succeed, we will never build a united movement that succeeds against austerity. But we have to be clear about the key role of the trade unions in shifting the Labour leadership into a position when it is doing its job, fighting the corner of working people. We all know the Labour Party was founded as the political wing of the Labour movement, and so it must remain. And one of the most important things I think it can do at the moment is build a coherent alternative to what is happening. Now, I'm involved at the moment with a think tank called Class, which has been set up by Unite and other trade unions such as GMB and PCS. And this isn't some sort of abstract, wishy-washy, intellectual exercise. What it's doing is building confidence in people that there is an alternative by bringing together economists and academics. Because our biggest enemy is resignation, a sense people have that it is impossible to oppose what is happening because there's no coherent alternative. So this is absolutely key, and I would just talk about some of the alternatives we should be pushing for. The government talk about the high levels of welfare spending, when in some sense, they've got a point. But it's not because of a bunch of lazy scroungers dribbling on sofas watching Jeremy Kyle all day, as the right-wing media would have it. It's a triple crisis. It's the jobs crisis, it's the housing crisis, and it's the low wages crisis. Take housing. £21 billion is being wasted on a housing benefit at the moment. That isn't going to the pockets of the tenants. That is lining the pockets of wealthy landlords who are charging extortionate rents because successive governments didn't build council housing and because of the abolition of rent controls. Instead of wasting all that money in housing benefit, let's build housing, council housing, which would bring down the 5 million strong social housing waiting list, stimulate the economy and create jobs, as well as taking down the welfare bill. Take the low wages crisis. Now, tax credits are a lifeline for millions of people in this country. But let's be clear about what they are. They're a subsidy for low pay because businesses won't pay their workers properly. Now, Len has called for the minimum wage to be increased by £1. And what that would do, as well as bringing down the millions being wasted on tax credits, the billions if you like, it'd also be a stimulus because when people at the bottom end have money in their pockets, they tend to spend it whilst people at the top save it. And of course the jobs crisis. As Keynes said in the 1930s, if you sort out the unemployment lines, the deficit will sort itself out. So we absolutely have to have jobs at the centre of what we're talking about. Let's talk about the banks. Proper democratic control of the banks, which were bailed out. Because the problem at the moment is we bailed out, we nationalised the debts and privatised the profits. And the TUC has yesterday passed policy to support proper democratic control of those banks. Let's talk about tax justice. We hear a lot about benefit fraud, but what about the billions being wasted because people at the top won't pay their taxes properly? People like Sir Philip Green, who's taking the mick. What he's done is registered his company under his wife's name in Monaco so he doesn't have to pay tax. And let's talk about an industrial strategy to create jobs, not least hundreds of thousands of green-collar, renewable energy jobs, skilled, decently paid jobs, which will take on the environmental crisis, but take on the jobs crisis too. And just to finally, just wrap up, I suppose, I'm glad Simon brought up the crisis, and it is a crisis, of working class representation. One of the key things trade unions can do is push to ensure that we have working class MPs who are rooted in the communities that they exist to represent. And again, I know Len has made it absolutely clear that from now on Unite will be pushing to ensure that working class candidates who support trade union policy will go and get selected as Labour candidates. Because if we don't do that, the issues that are important to all of us as a movement will never get a hearing if the Parliamentary Labour Party is dominated by people from some of the most privileged backgrounds we have. But I just want to say, I think we have absolutely every reason to have hope. Because the winds have shifted. The austerity programme has been utterly discredited. And we are up against the government, let's not forget, that has no mandate. I remember the last time the Tories won a general election, just about, because it was 1992, I was 7 years old and my teachers came dressed in black. But in the last election, it was handed to them on a plate, a disastrous economic situation, and if we're going to be honest, a woefully unpopular Labour government, but they lost. So let's stand together, let's fight together, and let's win together.